Go.
If you're an investor, you don't lose money in real estate because the market turns. You lose money because you made a rookie mistake before you even close. So let's make sure that's not you. If you're a first-time investor, this episode could save you thousands.
It's so true, right? Like so many investors,
Investors
because
don't
they
lose
have
money
a
in real
realtor that they
estate.
are
You lose
not.
money because you made a rookie mistake. Shoot, that's me. There we go. Sorry.
No worries. But no, a lot of investors, what happens is they choose a realtor that doesn't understand real estate investing. So then they lose money on the front end of the deal without even knowing it.
Yeah, and I've seen mistakes like this firsthand, and it's hard to watch through some clients that maybe, didn't consult or do all of their homework ahead of time, or they listen to their emotions versus following the numbers. So there's just these different tips that are really important to keep in mind so you don't lose thousands.
Yeah, and really the number one thing is you need to pick a realtor that really understands real estate investing, especially if you're new to it. And most realtors just don't because they sell houses to home buyers, so they don't necessarily understand what to look for from an investor point of view. But then if you hire that person, you also should listen to them. Because I can't tell you how many people hire me and then, they want to do something different, and that's okay, but these mistakes can cost you in the long run for your investments.
Yeah, and I think that, some realtors will say they're investor friendly or they have experience with investments, but they don't have any themselves. And, you really want somebody that has had them themselves, that has rolled up their sleeves and done the trial and error and has made the mistakes and has learned from doing versus, the textbook knowledge, right? I mean, we need somebody that knows what they're doing.
Well, because we've all sold investors property, right? Like there's a lot of realtors that work with investors that don't own anything and they sell somebody something, but they don't understand all the hardship that person went through because it was the wrong property. And people like us know the ins and outs of the business. Like I'm working with a guy right now. He's going to buy his first condo. He's going to live in it, but he wants to eventually rent it. So he wants to buy it as an investment kind of property. And you can get a 2-1 in this area a lot cheaper than a 2-2, 2-bed, 1-bath versus 2-bed, 2-bath. The problem is it's really hard to rent a 2-bedroom and 1-bathroom, like really hard because nobody wants to share a bathroom. And it's only about $400 more a month in your monthly payment, right? And so what I'm trying to explain to him is, yes, you can get it cheaper, but it's going to be so much harder to rent. So you have to weigh this stuff in. And it's just these little things. They're really small, right? But they're a big deal in the long run.
Yeah. And so it's important that, and that's what we're going to be talking about today, is it's so important to know exactly what to watch for. And that bathroom bedroom mix is one of them. People don't want to share a bathroom, so there's these things. We're going to talk about it today. So let's unpack it.
Yep, absolutely. So your first mistake, I thought this was a good one, was chasing the deal instead of the data. And this is where your emotions kind of get the best of you.
Yeah. I mean, sometimes you walk into a property and you get the feel of, oh, this is it. But you fail to look around at the neighborhood or at different delayed or deferred maintenance, I should say. So there are all of these factors where it's like, yes, it might feel like the one, but is it really checking all of the boxes? Are you using your brain instead of your heart to make your investing decisions?
Yeah. And I always tell clients, I take a lot of investors out and a lot of them are 1031s, right? So they have to find something within 45 days. So we're kind of crunched. So we'll go look at like 10 deals and they'll fully emotionally fall in love with one of the deals. Like they'll be like, I love this house. And I always say to them, we got to wait till we get home to crunch the numbers. Like I know you love this one, but this other one that you don't love as much, it actually makes more financial sense, and you have to remember that when you're shopping, because as an investor, you have to remember this is not where you're living. As a home buyer, very different. But as an investor, this is all, it comes down to the numbers and nothing but the numbers. I mean, you have to like the home. I always tell the investors, like, you have to feel good about it. You can't hate it. But at the same time, it really comes down to the data. What's your expenses? What's your income? Is it a place somebody would want to live? And that's it.
Yeah. And, I think you have to keep in mind, like, don't ignore your expenses, know your rental comparisons. You get the feeling when you walk through the property, but you have to revert back to the basics and don't chase the deal. You can't be desperate just to, I want to add one more portfolio to meet, one more property to meet my goal this year. You have to set all of that aside and really boil it down to the basics.
Yeah, and that's the thing too is going into it and saying, okay, this deal's listed at 500,000, it only makes sense at 460, right? So that is your final and best offer because that's what it makes sense at, and not going above that offer because they say no. Like you have to be really disciplined in that. Now, when you have a 1031, that's harder because you're on a time crunch. Mm-hmm. But if you're just an investor that's just buying something, and you have to wait for those, right deals to come along. And they're hard to find right now. It's not like you can easily find a cash flowing deal. So you just have to know at what number it starts to cash flow.
Yeah, and I think deferred gratification is one of the skills that is the most underlooked in real estate, in the business, because you can get caught up in the frenzy of chasing a deal. But, waiting is a skill that takes practice, and it's so important because you don't want to chase the wrong deal.
I know. I have clients sometimes they hire me and they're like, just so you know, I'm going to be really picky. And I love that because I'm like, yeah, like that's fine. Because what it is, as an investor, you're wanting that deal that works, and I have to correct some people too, because they'll call me and they say, I just want a really good deal. Well, what does that mean? Like what is a really good deal? Like, what does that mean? And to me as an investor, it means your deal cash flows, it pencils, it works, right? And for that, you have to take that emotion. Like, do you feel like you're getting a good deal? Because you could feel like you're getting a good deal on this 2-bed, 1-bath, but it doesn't cash flow because it's just so much cheaper. But then this 2-2 over here, because the rent's higher and it's more expensive, it actually does cash flow. So it's actually a better deal than this other one. So it's so interesting because you can't just look at a place and have a feel for it. You really, it's a math equation.
Yep. Taking the feelings out of it and going back to the math.
It's hard, it's hard. Like I was showing an investor the other day. She's like, I could see myself living here one day. I was like, no, that is not how we're looking at this. Like, this is an investment property. Like, you're not going to live here. Like, this is, if you happen to one day, great, but that's not, those are those emotions. Like, I could feel myself living here. I could, and it ended up being a great deal. We ended up buying it. It was awesome. Cash flow's great, but that's not how you want to look at an investment property.
No. Absolutely not. Which, talking about math, brings us to mistake number 2, underwriting and your expenses. So you could underestimate your expenses, and that is a huge mistake. So, you want to be realistic. You don't want to overestimate everything because then nothing's going to work. Mm-hmm. But you do really want to dial it in and do your due diligence. Get an insurance estimate. Talk to the county about what the taxes are going to be increasing to next year. Actually get the real data and information versus underestimating or even overestimating, because you're not going to get a deal done either way then.
Yeah, you can do either. But you're right. Most people underestimate. What they really lack is the capital improvements, the big stuff, the roof, if you're in a condo, the parking lot, like different things is what people really miss. And also HOAs. HOAs are a big one right now because they keep going up because expenses keep going up. So you have to really look at an HOA and look at all the deferred maintenance on a property. Ken and I were out in Vegas yesterday, and he has a condo out there, a couple condos, and we were looking because we're debating on listing them or re-renting them. And some guy from, that just lives there walks up. He's like, this HOA is great. I've been here 5 years. I've only had a $5 increase in 5 years. And, he like strolls away, all happy. And Ken's like, there's so much deferred maintenance. Like, he knows an assessment is coming on this building because, the parking lot's all chipped up, the roof, you can see the cracked tiles. Like, you can see all this deferred maintenance that the HOA is not addressing with their $5 increase in 5 years. So there's an assessment. So you have to look at that stuff too. You have to look at the health of the HOA, the property taxes, how much those have went up, like all these things. And people, they budget for day to day, week to week. They don't budget putting away money for these big projects. And eventually you're going to have to replace the roof. And eventually you're going to have to replace the air conditioning unit. You just are.
And I think it's so crazy that you say it's only gone up $5. To you and I, we both know that that's a red flag. To an average person that doesn't have experience with it, they're like, this is great. But $5 when everything else has gone up, it's deferred maintenance, or their balance in the HOA fund is like negative. So those are major red flags to look for. It's so wild to think that
it is
somebody thinks it's a good thing.
It is major red flags. And, people get worried when there's like an HOA assessment, like, oh, there was a $10,000 assessment. That can be concerning, as a buyer, because it depends on the health of the HOA now. But it's almost like if they gave everyone a $10,000 assessment, hopefully that got all the numbers back up in the account so that the account is in healthy financial shape, then I wouldn't worry about it. Now, if it's $10,000 and you get the financials and they still have no reserves, that's different. But, it can actually be a good sign, because inflation went up a lot the last few years and HOAs did not account for that, and they typically don't. However, if the balances are not good and the reserves aren't good and there's been no special assessments, you can probably guess that one is coming there. And when you put an offer in, you do get to take a peek under the hood and look at the financials. And that's really important on an HOA deal.
Yeah, for sure. And, you mentioned things like the furnace or the major mechanicals, roof, things like that. So best case scenario in my mind is you go in and all of the big things are done. The roof is done, the mechanicals have all been updated, but let's just say the walls are beat up, or, it's just kind of dirty. Like, those are all just cosmetic things. It's like if you have the right location and the right property that doesn't have deferred maintenance, but it's just like dirty, dingy, and needs some cosmetic facelift, that's where you can find some really good deals.
Yeah, and you have to account for vacancy too, because you put vacancy, and I swear nobody that I work with accounts for vacancy. And realistically, you're not having one tenant move in and 3 days later, or move out, and 3 days later the next tenant move in. You're going to have sometimes you get that, but sometimes you might have a month or two of vacancy. And this can be really burdensome on a new investor. And what happens, because I've seen it, is you don't have the money to cover the expenses and you didn't save anything for it because you were month to month. And then you rush to get anybody in that property because you can't afford for it to sit vacant for 30 days. So you get the wrong person in. You soften your criteria for credit and background check. And then you're in a real bind, because then if they don't pay you, then you have to evict them. I mean, it's just like this swirl of not good, right? That you rush to get somebody in because you have that pressure. So you always need to account for 5 to 10% of your earnings going into vacancy. And then that way, you should be able to, until sometimes you get a padding. Like, I have a lady that's been there for 5 years. I don't keep doing that because I have plenty of money in the account for that now. But you need to have a few months of expenses in the account and assume that it might take 60 days to rent the place, okay? Hopefully not, but it might. So you definitely need to account for that, because that panic is always what gets new investors in trouble. Shoving the wrong tenant in there because you don't have the money for it to sit vacant.
Yeah, and that's the fair point. Even if the local vacancy rate, people say it's 3%, still factor in for that 7 to 10. Be a little bit more realistic with it, because then you're not forced into being in a hurry to place a tenant or whatever. Like, you don't have to make a split-second decision. You can take your time and make better decisions that way when you do have reserves or when you have factored in for vacancy.
Absolutely. And I'm telling you, I literally know a girl this has happened to right at this second. It's a friend of mine that does, the friend that never listens to you, but she cannot have this house sit because she does not have the money for it. And she didn't have it rented before the other person moved out. And I told her, don't lower your criteria. Well, she did. And she moved this person in, and he keeps paying her 15 days late. You know what I mean? The money is supposed to come in and he pays a portion here and a portion there. And she's worried she's going to have to evict him. Because even in Arizona, which is a strong landlord state, it still can take 45, 60 days to get someone out of your house. And that's really fast. Like some of these states, it's like a year, right? But like Arizona, it's like 45 to 60 days because there's a process. You can't just kick somebody out. So you have to, prove they didn't pay rent and give them time to pay rent and then move it through the court system and then move it through the sheriff. Like there's all these things, right? She doesn't have the money for that. So the stress of, I don't have a tenant because I don't have the money to, have this thing sit vacant for 30 days. Well, guess what? Now you have someone living in it and you have to pay to do the eviction on top of someone not paying you. So her stress level did not go down. But if she just had 2 months of reserves where she could find a great tenant, that really helps your odds of not having to go through all that stress.
Yeah, and in the Midwestern states, you have to add the winter elements on top of it, and you can't legally shut off heat in winter months. So sometimes the property owners will get stuck with that too. So all the more reason to be selective, have your criteria and stick to it when it comes to tenant placement. Yep.
That's a big one. That's the biggest one that I see new investors make where they get out of the business because they're like, oh, this is not for me because they put the wrong tenants in there. And they typically put the wrong tenants in there because they didn't do a background check or they kind of did one, but they were loose with it. Or, they just, the person didn't make enough money to live there, but they kind of like glanced over that. I mean, all these things are... Because what you don't understand is my friends, like I keep getting bad tenants. And I said, we all get bad tenants that apply. You keep taking them because you're taking the first people. Whenever I list a place, I have 2 or 3 bad people, unqualified people that want to move in before I get my tenants. If I always took the first person that applied, 8 times out of 10, they don't qualify, So it's not like it's your bad luck. You're just getting this. You're taking it. And those of us that are experienced know to not bend our criteria. But since you're new, you just do it. And then you have a problem. And then you're like, this is a terrible business to be in, So it really is. I actually think that's the number one thing that new investors mess up on.
Well, and that just goes right back to the delayed gratification, whether it's finding a property or finding a tenant. It's a skill in the real estate world. It is definitely a skill.
Yeah.
Another rookie mistake that people make, number 3, is trying to do everything yourself.
Yep. I see this a lot, like fix things yourself or, avoid fixing things because you don't want to fix them. Like, what do you see it mainly on?
Painting, and some of the cosmetic things, it's like, okay, yep, I'll go in there on my day off and paint. Well, then you're in a hurry and you're doing it poorly. It's like sometimes time is money and hiring a professional to do the job. Yes, it might cost you a little bit more out of pocket, but in the long run, your unit is going to be in a lot better condition and present a lot better if you don't try to do everything yourself.
Yeah. And I see it too on people that buy something that needs a little bit of work and then they don't want to do the work, right? Like they're like, oh, like there's like nasty carpet or the floor doesn't match and they just don't do it. But realistically, like, you could do floors in a small rental for $6 or $7 grand, right? Which is not a lot of money. However, you're going to get a better tenant, right? Because a good tenant does not really want to live in a place where there's nasty carpet and none of the floors match. It just doesn't present the same way. I mean, you'll still be able to rent it, but probably not for what you want to rent it for. Where if you just add this little investment, all of a sudden you can get $300 more a month in rent. So it kind of pays for itself, right? In a couple years.
Absolutely. And I think that's so important because it's often overlooked, whether it's paint or flooring, depending on the size, even less expensive in my area. But like you said, the quality of the tenant goes up, the monthly income goes up, which makes your property worth more if you're even thinking of selling it. It's like bite the bullet, put in the money, have a nice place to market, and you get better tenants, better quality tenants that stay longer, that aren't going to be looking for, oh, my place is dingy, I just want to upgrade. Do it on the front end and you have longer term tenants that stay.
Absolutely. And the other thing, is interesting because I actually see the DIY, but I actually see the opposite too, where, my tenants or my new investors, they hire these really expensive companies to do things too. You know, they don't have like a good like every investor needs a good, affordable handyman that can do 80% of everything, right? Like, unless, you know, then sometimes you have to call in the HVAC guy, sometimes you have to call in a plumber, but like 80 to 90% of it can be done by a really good handyman. And the problem is like people get these contractors that are super expensive, right? So they might, you know, have like a small plumbing leak and it's $350 when a good handyman could have fixed that for $75 out the door, right? And or, you know, like I just sold my condo and I know that the AC works great because I had my AC company come look at it. Well, they move in, they have a little AC issue. They bring a random company in and it tells them you need to replace your whole entire air conditioning unit. And luckily I somehow, you know, the other realtor contacted me and I'm like, no, tell them to send my people back out. You probably need like, you know, antifreeze or something, but you know, you need this trusted group of people or else you're going to get screwed. And it's fine if you get screwed on your house because it's like here and there, but as you accumulate rentals and they're supposed to cash flow, the difference between a $400 fix and a $100 fix all the time, all through the year is cash flowing or not cash flowing.
Yep. Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think that, you know, time too is a currency. So it's like if you're sending somebody out there, you know, or you don't have to get several bids because you already have worked with that trusted handyman. So you're not calling 3 plumbers for 3 different bids. You know, you kind of have your process and your team all dialed in, and that makes everything so much more seamless, especially as you accumulate or grow from one rental to a handful and then on.
Yeah, you need your team to grow with you and you cannot deviate from that team. Like even if the tenant has to wait a couple days, they have to wait a couple days because you need people that you can trust. So if they say you need a new unit or you need this really expensive repair, you actually know that they're not lying to you.
Yeah.
Because they do that.
Time to build that trust.
Contractors do that, especially to us women. You know, they like know that we don't really know how it all works. And if you're just believing whatever somebody's telling you, you're going to be spending a lot of money.
Yeah. Asking questions helps a lot.
Yep. And getting second opinions. Those are always good too as you're finding your team. That's how you find your team, right? Maybe you have an air conditioning issue and you bring in 3 HVAC companies and then you realize which ones are full of it and which ones are being honest. And I tend to like the smaller companies or the individual providers because if you can find one that does a good job, typically they value that relationship, where sometimes on these bigger companies, they're paid on commission. And that's what you don't want because obviously replacing your whole HVAC unit, they're going to make more money than just doing, you know, $400 in antifreeze.
And one thing that I've actually talked to different contractors about, whether it's like HVAC or plumbing, is, you know, if they give me 2 options, like, well, you could fix it for this or replace it for this. And, you know, they're not really like steering you in one direction or the other. I always say, okay, well, if I was your daughter, what would you tell me to do? Because then they're going to be like, yeah, just fix it, you know? So it's like you kind of tug on their heartstrings and then you get the real answer out of them. So,
I like that. That's a good one.
Yeah.
Let's move to mistake number 4, which is no clear exit strategy. So you buy the property and you kind of, it's cash flowing or not, and your strategy is kind of, I'll figure it out later.
Yeah, so it's interesting to know, is it going to be a long-term hold? Or are you going to do some value add? Like if it's got old carpet and, you know, needs some cosmetic things, are you going to do that right away when you buy it? Or are you buying it as cash flowing from day one with the tenant already in there? You have to have the end in mind when you start and when you buy a property, because otherwise you don't know where you're going to be at, and if it's not clear, you're going to mess up.
Yeah, and you have to be flexible. That's why the cash flow is so important, because a lot of people buy for appreciation. You know, they want to buy it for X and sell it for Y, and that's okay. You pay tax, and there's, you know, negatives to that strategy, but I get it. However, the problem people get in is when it's not cash flowing and the value doesn't increase like you thought it would, and you're not making money on it, then it just becomes a big headache. So that's why the cash flow is so important, because the cash flow allows you to hold it or sell it. Like I'm going to list my condo in January, but it cash flows. So like if it doesn't sell in a couple months, I'm probably going to throw another tenant in there and just try again when the market's a little busier. So, but if I was losing money every month, then my only option would be to lower the price to try to, get it off my hands. So that's why that cash flow is like so important. And that's why we preach it so much.
Cash flow is important and appreciation is great, but never bank on it. Like, yes, it's kind of like, I look at it as the cherry on top. Like appreciation is great, but it has to cash flow from day one, or with a minor modification, it, has to cash flow if you do something to it. But ideally and ultimately it should cash flow from day one. And, maybe you're doing a value add and then that you're going to refinance, or, you're going to burr it, like where you buy, rehab, refinance, repeat, and you keep that and it's a long-term hold, then But if you don't have a plan, you're going to overpay or you're going to make a bad investment decision because you don't have the end in mind.
And it sucks. Like I've done that with one of my properties. Like there's a little bit more to it, why I bought it, but I knew that it broke even, right? Well, then rents went down a little bit in Phoenix. So now, and the HOA went up a little bit. So now it's negative every single month. And of course, this comes a property that needs a new roof. So what do I have to do? I have to take from another property to then pay. It's definitely not as fun, right? Because now I'm feeding it. And then additionally, when it needs something, I'm feeding it more. And so what I'm doing is I actually am refinancing it this year to then make it break even again. But now like my basis is even, because of all the expenses and things that have went up, and it's just not as fun, and I wouldn't do it again. It was a good learning lesson for me. I don't regret buying it because I know in the long run this is going to be a great property, but I also can afford to feed it. Like if you can't afford to feed it, then that even sucks more because now you're working a second job or stressing how you're going to pay or trying to up the rent with a worse tenant. You're doing all that. I at least don't have to do any of that, but it still sucks pulling from these cash flowing properties to dump into this non-cash flowing one, especially when I had to replace the roof. So I do think that, these are lessons that like we're trying to teach you that you just, you have to learn some of them on your own, but it's better to learn it through people.
Yeah, exactly. And if you don't have a clear exit strategy and, life changes or you have a job change or anything like that, and you, make a poor decision and you are upside down or feeding it a little bit every month, you never know when your circumstances can change. And then what does that do for the long-term economic viability of that property or of your whole financial picture? So you really do have to do your due diligence up front and have a plan.
Yeah, absolutely. And that brings us into mistake number 5. And so many people do this, but treating your rental like a hobby and not like a business.
Mm-hmm. That's a really good one because, if you're commingling your accounts or, missing your receipts and not getting them to your bookkeeper or keeping track of it yourself, then you're not really able to know your full profit or loss on the property, your return on investment, and all of those things are really important. So it's important on the financial side, but then you flip side to the tenants and it's, they call you up and say, my dog ran away and I haven't been able to work because I'm looking for it or whatever, and they're late on rent. Well, you have to treat it like a business. Like, yes, it's okay to have empathy on certain situations, but if you give an inch, tenants can sometimes take a mile, and that's not the greatest thing either. So there's all of these facets where you want to totally treat it like a business because it is not a hobby. I mean, it's, financial livelihood.
And your tenants are not your friends. And I actually had to learn kind of, not that I was ever friends with my tenants, but when I first started, it was like I knew my tenants. I chatted with them all the time. I knew when they were getting married, and I, knew all the problem with that is that then they think that you're their friend. And then when they can't pay rent, it's a much weirder conversation because you have this relationship, and all of a sudden you're like, yeah, it's okay if you're a few days late. And then every month they're a few days late. And then, and it just turns into you kind of getting taken advantage of. It's no different than like at work. If you're a boss, you can't be friends with the people that work with you for the same reason. You can be friendly, but you can't have those relationships because there comes a time where you have to tell them, hey, this is what it is. And it's way harder if you have this like personal relationship, And then, you don't want to know too much. You know what I mean? And so What's better is just having a very professional relationship, as you would, because it gets tricky even for me to this day with tenants, because I have a heart and I feel for certain situations a lot, but you also can't, you have to treat legally all your tenants the same. So you can't give one person 5-day grace period with no fees, and then somebody else, if they're a day late, charge them, right? You have to have, that's why you have these procedures across the board. And, those relationships kind of get in the way of it. It's just better to have a very professional relationship. And it's a big one, because it's so easy to want to be friendly. And typically when people move in, everything's good and everyone's nice. And, but sometimes that can change.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's maybe a little bit harder in the rural areas where we're such a small town, where it's like, my family knows you or knows your cousins or, whatever it is. So it really is hard, and it is a fine line, because like you say, you have a heart, but at the end of the day, it still is business. So where does that line fall? And, making sure that you're making a business decision on everything, all of the above. What is a rental rate? If you feel like you want to give somebody a deal, which if that's a business decision that you make, that is, an option. But then how does that affect your financials going forward? Because what if they stay for several years? You take, $50 or $100 under market rate, and you take that times 3 years. Well, are you really wanting to make that decision or not?
Plus sometimes you can screw your tenants that way too. So during COVID, I felt really bad for my tenants, because, there's a lot of financial, so I didn't raise rent for like 3 years, right? I just kept it the same. Well, then all of a sudden I'm looking at my financials and I'm like, oh my God, my HOA went up. This went up. The rental rates are extremely higher. So I had to raise rent on my one tenant $900 a month. I had to. I was so... I really should have been doing 200 here, 200 there, because that's what rental rates were doing. And she was already a little under market. Well, she got really mad at me. And I can't really blame her, because it kind of blindsided her, right? But it was my fault, because I wasn't gradually increasing it on her. And I was doing it to be nice. But then at the end of the day, she was upset. She was still a little bit below what she told me to pound sand, and she was moving. But then a couple weeks later, after looking around, she stayed. But it was because I wasn't overcharging her. I just, as a landlord, you can't be that negative. Like, you can't, because that's going to catch up with you. And we're seeing it now as our rents have went down a little and expenses have went up. Like, there's good and bad sides to the business. But here I am trying to be so nice, and then it backfires on me, because now she's not like, well, you saved me all this money for the last 3 years. It's like, you're screwing me over, and I got to figure out now how to budget this $900 increase. And it was crappy. I mean, I felt bad about it. I shouldn't have done it like that, but that was my lesson. So, you have to make sure, you don't want your tenants, they can be a little under market, but you don't want them way under market, unless you just plan on riding that out the whole entire time they're there, because that doesn't benefit you. And these big increases don't benefit them.
Yeah. And it is important. I had something similar where, a renter of mine, they were going to leave too, because I said, hey, insurances went up 25%, property taxes went up 30%. There's a local levy. Now there's this rental ordinance that has a fee, all of these things. And I said, I'm not raising rent to put more money in my pocket. I'm raising rent just to cover the expenses of the property, essentially. And they went out, they did their research, they looked at 3 different comparable properties that were in the area, in the same vicinity, same condition, bedroom, bath count. And what did they come to the conclusion of? They were still about $150 under market rate, even after me raising the rent. And instead of getting all mad and angry about it, they, said thank you and sent me a thank you note in the mail. And it's like, I'm not trying to be the bad guy, but it is a business. And I'm okay with this rate, and you're still under market rate, and it's a win-win situation, which I think is the best case scenario.
It is. It's just, but once again, you have to, so they might be upset with you. Like, that's why you have to just keep those lines like super clear as far as like friend versus tenant,
Yeah. Earlier in the our conversation, you mentioned, taking some funds from one property to cover another. Do you have separate accounts for every single property, or is it more so in your bookkeeping?
I do. So when I move it over, I move it to myself and then I move it to the next property. So I don't move it from like straight from one to the other because they're all different accounting. So you can't do that. Or you can, but it would make it a lot more confusing because they each have their own. And I think it's good to have their own separate accounting. For one, they're each their own business, their own LLC, but also just so you know, like this one made this much this year, this one made this much. It's very telling at the end of the year to see, what all your properties are making. But yeah, so that's kind of how I do it. How do you do it?
Everything that's in my LLC, I have a couple properties in the LLC. So if I buy another one, I'll probably start a new one just so there's not so many in each individual LLC. However, I do have my monthly bookkeeper that codes each expense to each property. So I can still, have a report at the end of the year that says, okay, on this address, I made this much. On this address, I went backwards a little bit because we had some capital expenses come through. So I can still tell which properties are outperforming the others, but it does run through one LLC right now for the ones that I own myself.
Yep. I do my own bookkeeping. It's probably not the cleanest, but I do a pretty good job. So
you can show me your ways because that is a weakness. I don't have it. I don't have the passion for it. So I do have help with it.
Sometimes it's good to outsource that stuff, right? If you don't have the passion for it. But yeah, so these are really good rookie mistakes that you want to avoid. And like I said, the best thing to do if you're a new investor, I think, is to really have a good realtor in your back pocket that really knows investments, and they should own investments. Like that is a big thing to me. Like if they don't own at least 2 investment properties, that's not who you should be working with if you're an investor. Like it just isn't because they're just not going to know. And so if you work with an investor, you're going to get a much different experience on looking at rentals.
Yeah. And there's a lot of other educational tools too. We've got some books, some podcasts and things that we can share in the comments. There are resources that have helped both of us get to where we've been. And if this episode has helped you at all, please share it with somebody that needs it. Feel free to reach out to either Danille or I at any time, and we'd love to continue the conversation.
Yeah, our contact information is just going to be in the bottom there, and we'll see you guys next week.